A leopard's only cub can't climb trees, and the reason why made everyone cry. At first, it looked like weakness, a flaw that doomed the little one in the wild. But when the truth came out, it shattered every assumption. A scientist who thought he'd seen it all is suddenly confronted with a choice that puts his career, his safety, and his very beliefs on the line. Behind this cub's struggle lies a secret tied to greed, betrayal, and survival, and it forces one man to risk everything to uncover it. The cub's fight is more than just about survival. It's about justice. What would you do if saving one fragile life meant exposing the darkest truth of all? You being here is a reminder. The quiet acts of love and kindness still matter. If you hold space for compassion, you're already part of this community. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Montana's rugged hills as Dr. Samuel Quito adjusted his binoculars. His weathered hands, marked by decades of fieldwork, steadied the lenses as he tracked movement in the distance. 20 years of studying wildlife had taught him patience, but what he witnessed now made his breath catch in his throat. A leopardess, her coat gleaming golden in the dawnlight, moved with fluid grace through the rocky terrain. Samuel had documented her presence in these hills for months now, but today was different. Behind her, stumbling over the uneven ground, followed a small cub. Extraordinary, Samuel whispered to himself, scribbling quick notes in his field journal. The sight of the pair sparked a warmth in his chest that had grown familiar over his years of observation. It was moments like these that reminded him why he'd chosen this path, despite all its challenges. But as he continued to watch, something wasn't right. The cub's movements caught his trained eye, while the mother moved with characteristic feline fluidity. The little one struggled to keep pace. Samuel zoomed in closer with his binoculars, his forehead creasing with concern. The cub dragged its right hind leg slightly, creating an uneven gait that slowed its progress. When the mother paused near a tall pine tree, Samuel's unease deepened. He'd seen this scenario play out countless times before. Leopard cubs learning to climb, their survival depending on this crucial skill. The mother leopard demonstrated, as Samuel had witnessed many times before. She leaped gracefully onto the trunk, her claws finding purchase in the rough bark. She looked down at her cub, waiting expectantly. Samuel held his breath. The cub approached the tree, placing its front paws against the bark. It made several attempts to pull itself up, but each time, the weakness in its hind leg prevented it from gaining the height it needed. After the third try, the little one slumped to the ground, letting out a small, frustrated sound that carried across the quiet morning air. "Come on, little one," Samuel whispered, though he knew his encouragement couldn't help. His heart ached as he watched the scene unfold. The mother leopard descended, touching noses with her cub in a gesture that seemed almost like consolation. Samuel lowered his binoculars, his hand shaking slightly. In his 2 decades of wildlife biology, he'd seen animals overcome incredible obstacles, but this was different. A leopard that couldn't climb was like a bird that couldn't fly. It struck at the very core of their survival strategy. He pulled out his notebook again, making detailed observations about the cub's condition. The leg didn't appear to be freshly injured. The way the cub moved suggested this was a chronic condition, perhaps something present from birth. The mother's behavior showed she'd adapted to her cub's limitation, moving more slowly, choosing paths that avoided steep climbs. The morning light grew stronger as Samuel continued his documentation. He watched as the pair made their way across the landscape, the mother constantly adjusting her pace to match her struggling offspring. When they needed to rest, instead of seeking the safety of trees as leopards typically would, they found shelter in a small cave at the base of a rocky outcropping. The sight filled Samuel with a complex mix of emotions. There was beauty in the mother's devotion, but also a deep concern for their future. Leopards relied on their ability to climb not just for hunting, but for safety from other predators. How would this cub survive as it grew older? How long could the mother continue to compensate for its disability? He took one last look through his binoculars, focusing on the cub's face. Despite its limitation, there was still a bright alertness. In its eyes, a willingness to keep trying despite its struggles. The mother settled beside it, grooming its fur with gentle strokes of her tongue, a picture of protective love that transcended species. Samuel packed up his equipment with careful, deliberate movements, his mind heavy with what he'd observed. As a scientist, he was trained to maintain emotional distance, to observe and document without intervention. But as he made his way back to his research station, he couldn't shake the image of that cub's determined attempts to climb, or the mother's. Patient adaptation to her offspring's needs. The morning's discovery would require careful documentation in his research logs. But Samuel knew this observation would haunt him far beyond the simple recording of scientific facts. As he walked, the weight of his equipment seemed lighter than the weight of the knowledge he now carried. Knowledge that would soon force him to make difficult decisions about the limits of scientific objectivity and the role of compassion in wildlife biology. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Samuel made his way down the familiar trail, his footsteps automatic while his mind remained with the leopard pair. Each step took him further from them physically, but he knew that mentally he would remain in that moment of discovery, watching a young cub struggle against limitations that nature had imposed, and wondering what role, if any, he should play. In its future, the morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana wilderness as Dr. Samuel Quito adjusted his binoculars. His weathered hands, marked by decades of fieldwork, steadied the lenses as he tracked movement in the distance. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine needles and wild sage, reminding him of countless mornings spent observing nature's delicate dance. Through his binoculars, he watched a magnificent leopardess moving gracefully through the underbrush. Her muscled form slipped between the trees like liquid gold, her coat a masterpiece of rosettes catching the early light. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just the mother. Behind her, a small cub followed, its spotted coat still fuzzy with youth. Extraordinary, he whispered to himself, careful not to disturb the scene before him. In all his years studying wildlife in these hills, such an intimate glimpse of these normally elusive creatures was rare. He reached slowly for his notebook, never taking his eyes off the pair. The mother paused near a fallen log, her ears swiveling to catch every sound in the forest. Samuel noticed something odd about the way the cub moved. While the mother's movements were fluid and precise, the little one seemed to struggle. His trained eye caught the subtle irregularity in its gait. The cub dragged its right hind leg slightly, creating a small trail in the pine needles covering the forest floor. Samuel's heart sank as he watched the young leopard try to keep pace with its mother. When they approached a large oak tree, the mother easily bounded up the trunk, but the cub remained at the base, crying out in distress. Samuel's scientific mind immediately began cataloging the implications. A leopard that couldn't climb was at a severe disadvantage. They relied on trees for safety, for hunting, for survival itself. His pen hovered over his notebook, but he couldn't bring himself to write. The usual clinical observations felt wrong. Somehow, "Come on, little one," he whispered, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. The cub made several attempts to follow its mother, each try ending in failure. The mother leopardess returned to the ground, touching noses with her offspring before leading it away through the underbrush. Samuel sat back against a tree, his binoculars hanging loose around his neck. 20 years of scientific training told him to maintain his distance, to observe and document without interference. Nature had its own way of handling these situations. But something deeper, more personal, pulled at him. He opened his notebook, staring at the blank pages. The proper protocol was clear. Document the disability, track the probable outcomes, maintain scientific objectivity. Yet his hand trembled slightly as he began to write. Instead of the usual detached observations, he found himself noting the cub's determination, the mother's patience, the way they adapted their movements to accommodate the disability. "This isn't just data," he murmured, running a hand through his graying hair. "This is life." The scientific part of his brain reminded him of his position, his reputation, his responsibilities. Intervention could cost him his career, his credibility, everything he'd worked for. But as he watched the pair disappear into the forest, he knew he couldn't simply write this off as another field observation. Samuel packed up his equipment with unusual care, his movements deliberate as he made his decision. He would continue to monitor them, but not just as a scientist studying subjects. He would watch over them, protect them if needed, even if it meant crossing the line between observer and guardian. He marked the location carefully in his GPS device, noting the time and direction of their movement. This wasn't just about data collection anymore. This was about giving a fighting chance to a creature that needed help, even if that help meant nothing more than being present, being ready. As he hiked back to his research station, Samuel's mind raced with possibilities. He could adjust his regular observation routes to include more frequent checks on the pair. He could document their adaptations, learn from their resilience. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to help without interfering directly. The weight of his decision settled on his shoulders, but it felt right. Sometimes, he realized, the most scientific thing to do was to acknowledge that nature's story wasn't just about survival of the fittest. It was about adaptation, about finding new ways to thrive despite challenges. He reached his small cabin just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. Opening his notebook one more time, he made a final entry for the day. Subject observation has become priority monitoring case. Will maintain daily surveillance. It was the most professional way he could phrase what his heart had already decided. He was now this cub's secret guardian, regardless of what his colleagues might think. The cub stumbled, letting out a soft mewl that made Samuel's heart clench. He shifted his position behind the natural blind of bushes, careful not to make any sudden movements. The mother's protective instincts were razor-sharp, and he couldn't risk startling them. Through his binoculars, he noticed something metallic, glinting in the morning light, partially hidden beneath fallen leaves about 20 yards from where the leopards had passed. Samuel marked the location in his mind, waiting patiently until the pair moved further into the forest before investigating. Once the coast was clear, he approached the spot with careful steps, his boots barely making a sound on the forest floor. As he brushed away the decay of last autumn's leaves, his fingers touched cold metal. His stomach turned as he uncovered what he'd feared, a rusty snare, its steel cable frayed and broken. "Dear God," he muttered, picking up the cruel device. The wire showed signs of desperate struggle, bent and twisted where something or someone had fought for freedom. Small traces of dried blood on the mechanism told a story that made his hands shake with anger. Samuel sat back on his heels, the broken snare heavy in his hands. The cub's injuries suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't a birth defect or a natural accident. This was deliberate human cruelty. The thought of the young leopard fighting against this metal trap, probably while its mother watched helplessly, made his jaw clench. He carefully photographed the snare and logged its GPS coordinates in his field notebook. As he worked, voices carried from the valley below. Samuel recognized the deep rumble of pickup trucks moving along the dirt road that marked the boundary between wilderness and ranchland. Keeping low, he made his way to a ridge overlooking the valley. 3 trucks had stopped and a group of Ranchers stood in a loose circle, gesturing toward the hills. Even from this distance, Samuel could read their body language. Tension, anger, fear. He'd heard the whispers in town. Complaints about predators were growing louder, with every lost calf or sheep blamed on the local wildlife. The leopardess and her cub had become unwitting targets in an age-old conflict between wilderness and civilization. Walking back to his research station, Samuel passed Pete's General Store, where several ranchers gathered around the coffee pot. Their conversation died as he entered, but not before he caught fragments of their worried discussion. "Third calf this month," one man was saying. "Can't afford to lose anymore. Those fancy wildlife folks don't care about our livelihood," another added, giving Samuel a pointed look. "They're more worried about their precious predators than honest working people." Samuel felt their stares as he collected his supplies. He'd known these men and their families for years, had shared meals with them, helped during tough times. But now a wall was rising between them, built of fear and misunderstanding. Back in his small office, Samuel spread his photos across the desk. The snare, the cub's injury, the growing tension in the community, it all painted a disturbing picture. His scientific training urged caution, demanded objectivity. But as he looked at the image of the broken snare, he couldn't stay detached. The leopard cub's disability wasn't just a notation in his research logs anymore. It was evidence of a darker side of human nature, of the quick solutions people reached for when fear overcame reason. The same fear he'd seen in the rancher's eyes could easily lead to more snares, more injuries, more death. Samuel ran his fingers through his graying hair, feeling the weight of his position more heavily than ever. As a wildlife biologist, his role was to observe and document, not to intervene. But as he stared at the cruel metal device on his desk, he knew he had crossed a line. The cub's struggle for survival had become personal. He pulled out his field journal and began writing, his pen moving quickly across the paper. Every detail mattered now. The location of the snare, the cub's movement patterns, the increasing hostility from the local community. If he was going to help protect these animals, he needed more than just scientific data. He needed to understand the human element of this equation. The afternoon light slanted through his office window as he worked, casting long shadows across his desk. Outside, the Montana wilderness stretched vast and beautiful, but now he saw it differently. Every shadow could hide another trap. Every peaceful scene could mask another threat. The simple marvel of watching wild creatures had been replaced by a deeper, more complicated understanding of the challenges they faced. Samuel knew his decision to monitor the cub more closely would raise eyebrows among his colleagues. Scientific objectivity was the foundation of his profession. But as he carefully filed away the evidence of human interference, he realized that sometimes the greatest scientific truth lay in acknowledging our impact on the natural world and taking responsibility for it. Samuel clutched the broken snare tighter, his knuckles turning white. He knew he couldn't handle this alone, not if he wanted to help the injured cub. After carefully documenting the location and photographing the snare with his phone, he tucked the cruel device into his backpack. The weight of it seemed to pull at his conscience with every step back to his truck, that the drive into town gave him time to think. He needed someone who understood both the medical aspects and the delicate nature of wildlife intervention. That's when he remembered Elena Ruiz, the new veterinarian who'd recently set up practice on the outskirts of town. He'd heard talk about her work with injured predators at her previous job in Wyoming. The veterinary clinic was a modest building painted in warm earth tones. A bell chimed softly as Samuel pushed open the door, the scent of antiseptic mixing with the aroma of coffee from a pot brewing in the corner. Elena looked up from her paperwork, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes sharp. and questioning. Dr. Ruiz? Samuel began, then hesitated. I'm Dr. Samuel Keogh. I'm working on the leopard population study in the Northern Hills. Elena's expression shifted from professional courtesy to genuine interest. The research project everyone's been talking about. What brings you here? Samuel pulled out the snare and placed it on her desk. Elena's face darkened as she picked it up, examining the dry blood with practiced eyes. Where did you find this? She asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Near where a mother leopard and her cub have been ranging. The cub, Samuel's voice caught. The cub can't climb. Drags its hind leg. Now I know why. Elena set the snare down with deliberate care. You're thinking of intervening? I could lose my position for even considering it, Samuel admitted. But watching that cub struggle, he ran a hand through his hair. I can't just document it. Slow death. Good, Elena said firmly, standing up. Because I wouldn't have let you. She moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out some papers. I've dealt with similar cases. There are protocols we can follow, ways to make this official and protect ourselves legally. A knock at the door interrupted them. Both turned to see a tall, weathered man in flannel and work boots standing in the doorway. His hands, Samuel noticed, bore the kind of scars that came from years of hard work. Marcus, Elena greeted him. You're early for Buck's checkup. Marcus Hale's eyes were fixed on the snare on Elena's desk. His face had gone pale, then flushed with anger. Where'd you find that? He demanded. Samuel explained the situation. With each word, Marcus's expression grew more intense. My brother died trying to free a wolf from one of those, Marcus said quietly, his voice rough with old pain. Got caught in a second snare he didn't see. By the time I found him, he shook his head sharply, as if dispelling the memory. Elena touched Marcus's arm gently. We could use your help, Marcus. You know these hills better than anyone. You can track, and you understand what we're up against. Marcus was silent for a long moment, staring at the snare. The people who set these things, he said finally. They're careful, smart, been dodging game wardens for years. He looked up at Samuel, but I know their patterns. Where they like to set up. Been watching them since my brother. He trailed off again. Samuel felt hope rising in his chest. Will you help us? Marcus picked up the snare, his scarred hands running over the twisted wire. Yeah, he said finally. About time somebody did something about this. But we do it smart. Do it right. Elena pulled out a map of the area. We'll need to document everything. Create a paper trail that justifies intervention. Samuel, you have your research permits. I have my veterinary credentials. Marcus knows the land and can help us avoid the wrong kind of attention. They gathered around the map as Elena marked potential sites for a mobile veterinary station. Marcus pointed out likely trap lines and safe approach routes. Samuel shared his observations of the leopard's movement patterns. It won't be easy, Elena warned, looking between them. If we're caught, there will be consequences. The ranchers won't like it. The authorities might not back us. My brother died because people looked the other way, Marcus said firmly. I'm done with that. Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of the decision, but also a sense of rightness. The cub deserves a chance. And maybe this can help change things. Show people there's a better way. Elena smiled, her eyes bright with determination. Then, let's get to work. We'll need supplies, equipment, and we'll need to move fast. That cub won't last forever with that injury. As they began planning in earnest, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope mixed with purpose. In Elena's quiet confidence and Marcus's hard-won knowledge, he found the strength he needed to move beyond observation to action. Together, they might just be able to save not only the cub, but also prove that compassion had a place in wildlife conservation. The unlikely alliance of scientist, veterinarian, and former tracker began taking shape around Elena's small office, each bringing their own wounds and wisdom to the task ahead. The broken snare lay on the desk between them, a symbol of what they were fighting against and what they were fighting for. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clinic's parking lot as Samuel finished explaining the situation to Elena. Just as she began examining the snare he'd brought, the clinic's door swung open with force. Calvin Hargrove's imposing figure filled the doorway, his expensive boots clicking against the linoleum floor. "Well, if it isn't our resident wildlife expert," Calvin drawled, his smile not reaching his eyes. He was dressed in pristine ranching, attire that looked more suited for a business meeting than working the land. "Causing trouble again, Dr. Keto?" Samuel straightened his back, acutely aware of how Calvin's broad shoulders and commanding presence seemed to shrink the room. "Mr. Hargrove, I didn't expect to see you here. Word travels fast in small towns," Calvin said, moving closer. His polished belt buckle caught the fluorescent light, especially when certain scientists start poking their noses where they don't belong. Elena stepped forward, the snare still in her hands. "This is a private consultation, Mr. Hargrove." Calvin's eyes flickered to the metal wire in her hands, his expression hardening. "That's an interesting piece of equipment you've got there. Found it on private property, did you, Dr. Keto?" "It was on public land," Samuel replied firmly, though his heart raced. "Within my study area." Calvin chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Nature has its way of dealing with things, Doctor. Predators and prey, survival of the fittest. Isn't that what you scientists preach? Best not to meddle." "Illegal snares aren't nature," Samuel countered, his voice tight with controlled anger. Calvin moved closer, lowering his voice. "Let me be clear. Your permits to study in this area depend on good relationships with local landowners and state officials. I'd hate to see those relationships deteriorate." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Samuel felt his stomach knot as he realized the depth of what he was facing. This wasn't just about one injured cub anymore. This was about power, influence, and the dark underbelly of local politics. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hargrove?" Samuel asked quietly. "Threatening?" Calvin's laugh was sharp. "I'm giving you friendly advice. I've already had some interesting conversations with the State Wildlife Board about your recent activities. They're quite concerned about a researcher who can't maintain professional distance from his subjects." Elena stepped between them, her chin raised defiantly. "I think you should leave, Mr. Hargrove." "Of course, Dr. Ruiz." Calvin adjusted his expensive leather jacket. "But remember, Dr. Keto, some things are bigger than one crippled cub. Your career, for instance." He turned to leave, then paused. At the door, "The State Board will be reviewing all current research permits next week. Might want to think hard about your priorities before then." After Calvin left, Samuel sank into a chair, the full weight of the situation crushing down on him. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. Years of research, his professional reputation, all hanging by a thread because he dared to care about one injured animal. Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "He's connected to the snares, isn't he?" "I can't prove it," Samuel replied, his voice heavy. "But this goes deeper than I thought. He's got the state officials in his pocket, and he's not afraid to use that influence. So what will you do?" Elena asked, setting the snare down on her examination table. Samuel stared at the cruel device, thinking about the cub struggling to climb, about its mother trying to protect it in a world stacked against them. The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "What I have to do," he said firmly. "Whatever the cost." Just then, a knock at the back door made them both jump. Elena cautiously opened it to reveal Marcus, a local tracker known for his knowledge of the area's wildlife. His weathered face was grim as he entered. "Heard Hargrove was here," Marcus said, his voice rough. "Figured you might need some help." He hesitated, then added, "My brother died checking illegal snares 2 years ago. Never could prove who set them, but..." He left the sentence hanging. Samuel looked between Elena and Marcus, seeing determination in both their faces. In the span of one afternoon, he'd gained 2 allies and 1 powerful enemy. The stakes had just gotten much higher, but he wasn't alone anymore. Calvin Hargrove's threats echoed in his mind, along with the image of the struggling cub. His career, his reputation, everything he'd worked for was at risk. But as he looked at the broken snare on Elena's examination table, he knew he couldn't walk away. The system might be corrupt, but that didn't make it right. The evening sky darkened as Samuel, Elena, and Marcus crouched behind dense brush near the temporary enclosure they'd constructed at the edge of the forest. Their hearts pounded with anticipation. The metal cage, carefully disguised with natural materials, stood ready to receive its intended occupant. Elena checked her tranquilizer rifle one final time. "The dosage is precise," she whispered, her breath visible in the cool air. "We'll have about 45 minutes once I make the shot." Samuel nodded, his eyes fixed on the clearing ahead where they'd spotted the leopardess and her cub earlier that day. Marcus kept watch, his weathered hands gripping binoculars. The waiting felt endless. "Movement," Marcus muttered suddenly. 10 o'clock. Through the gathering dusk, they saw them. The leopardess leading her cub, moving with careful grace. The cub's distinctive limp made Samuel's chest tighten. This was their chance. Elena raised her rifle slowly, steadying her breathing. The cub limped into clear view, pausing to sniff at the bait they'd laid. The mother remained alert, scanning the surroundings. "Now," Samuel breathed. The dart flew true, striking the cub's flank. The young cat yelped in surprise, and the leopardess whirled around, her eyes scanning for threats. For a heart-stopping moment, she seemed ready to charge their position. "Stay still," Marcus warned, barely audible. The tranquilizer took effect quickly. As the cub stumbled, its mother circled in, obvious distress, growling low. They watched, hardly daring to breathe, as the cub finally slumped to the ground. The leopardess wouldn't leave. She paced, nudging her unconscious cub, growing increasingly agitated. Elena had prepared for this, loading a second dart with a mild sedative. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and fired again. The mother cat barely reacted to the hit, but within minutes, she too began to sway. She fought it longer than her cub had, but eventually lay down beside her baby, her eyes slowly closing. "Move now," Samuel commanded. They rushed forward with the transport cage and medical supplies. Elena immediately began examining the cub's injured leg while Samuel and Marcus prepared to move both cats into the enclosure. The night silence shattered with the sound of approaching vehicles. "Calvin's men," Marcus spat, recognizing the engine sounds. They must have been watching. Headlights swept through the trees. Samuel's mind raced. "Get them inside, quick." They worked frantically to move both leopards into the enclosure. Elena's hands flew over the cub's leg, documenting the damage with her phone's camera. The vehicles were getting closer. Just as they secured the enclosure's door, 3 pickup trucks burst into the clearing. Calvin Hargrove stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 4 men carrying rifles. Well, Calvin's voice cut through the darkness. "Quite the operation you've got here, Dr. Keto." Samuel stepped forward, positioning himself between Calvin and the enclosure. "This is authorized wildlife research, Mr. Hargrove. You're interfering with a scientific study." Calvin's laugh held no warmth. "Boys, check that cage. Make sure it's up to code for dangerous animals." 2 men circled the enclosure, their boots crunching on fallen leaves. One produced bolt cutters from his truck. "Stop!" Elena shouted. "You'll endanger everyone here." The men ignored her, attacking the reinforced panels of the enclosure. Metal screamed as they pried at the joints, creating gaps in the structure. Marcus moved to intervene, but Samuel grabbed his arm. "Don't. They're armed." They watched helplessly as Calvin's men methodically damaged the enclosure, leaving it barely intact. The leopardess stirred inside, the commotion bringing her around faster than expected. "Let's go, boys," Calvin called out, satisfaction clear in his voice. "I'm sure the proper authorities will be very interested in this unauthorized containment facility." He turned to Samuel. "I warned you about meddling, Doctor. Some folks just won't learn." The trucks roared away, leaving chaos in their wake. The enclosure groaned ominously as the leopardess regained consciousness, her growls growing stronger. "We need to stabilize this structure," Marcus said urgently, already pulling rope from his pack. Elena worked swiftly to check the cub, while Samuel and Marcus reinforced the damaged panels. The leopardess was fully awake now, testing the weakened walls with increasing force. "The cub's leg shows signs of tissue damage consistent with a snare," Elena reported quickly. "But we need more time to a metal panel buckled with a sharp crack." The leopardess hurled herself against the weakened spot, her full weight making the entire structure shudder. "Get back!" Samuel yelled. They retreated as another panel gave way. The leopardess burst through the opening, immediately turning to locate her cub. "Don't move," Marcus warned, his voice tight with tension. They stood frozen as the mother cat gathered her bearings. The cub was still unconscious, trapped inside the failing enclosure. The leopardess's eyes locked onto them, teeth bared, her powerful muscles coiled to spring. Samuel's mind raced. All their careful planning destroyed in minutes by Calvin's interference. The mother cat took a step toward them, her growl vibrating through the clearing. Behind her, the damaged enclosure held her vulnerable cub, their one chance at helping. It slipping away in a nightmare of twisted metal and primal fear. Samuel stood in the makeshift veterinary tent, watching the leopard cub's labored breathing. The small creature lay on its side, its injured leg now properly bandaged, but its body burning with fever. Elena moved quietly around the examination table, checking vital signs with a grim expression that made Samuel's heart sink even further. "The infection's getting worse," Elena said softly, placing a gentle hand on the cub's flank. "The original wound from the snare was deeper than we thought. And the stress of capture." She trailed off, shaking her head. Samuel pressed his palms against his tired eyes. 3 days had passed since their rescue attempt, and instead of triumph, each hour brought mounting pressure and devastating setbacks. His phone buzzed again, another message from the wildlife department. He didn't need to read it to know its contents. More accusations, more threats. "They're calling for an official inquiry," he said, his voice hollow. "The department claims I violated protocol, endangered protected species, acted without proper authorization." He laughed bitterly. "Calvin's fingerprints are all over this." Through the tent's entrance, he could see reporters gathering at the perimeter they'd established. Calvin Hargrove's latest press statement had painted Samuel as a reckless outsider, someone exploiting a tragic situation for personal gain. The local papers ate it up. The wealthy rancher, defending traditional values against an interfering scientist. Marcus entered the tent, his face etched with concern. "More trouble brewing? Some of Calvin's men are stirring up the other ranchers. They're saying your experiment is putting their livestock at risk." He paused, looking at the suffering cub. "How's the little one doing?" Elena shook her head again. "Temperature's 104.2. If we can't break this fever soon." Samuel walked to the corner of the tent, bracing himself against the supply table. His career 20 years of dedicated research and conservation work was crumbling. He'd violated protocols, yes, but only because the system was rigged to protect people like Calvin. Every proper channel had been blocked, every official complaint buried. Maybe, he started, his voice cracking. Maybe we should stop. Release the cub back to its mother. At least then it could die in freedom instead of... He gestured helplessly at the medical equipment surrounding them. The silence in the tent grew heavy. Elena stepped away from the cub, approaching Samuel with fierce determination in her eyes. You don't mean that. This isn't just about one cub anymore. This is about standing up to corruption, about showing that compassion matters more than politics. Compassion won't mean much if we lose our licenses, Samuel countered. If Calvin wins, he'll keep setting those illegal snares. More animals will suffer. His shoulders slumped. Sometimes you have to know when to walk away. Marcus moved closer, his weathered face tight with emotion. My brother didn't die in one of Calvin's snares, so we could walk away when things got tough. His voice was low but intense. You saw something wrong and chose to act. That matters, Samuel. It matters more than careers or reputations. Samuel looked back at the cub, remembering the first time he'd spotted it limping behind its mother. The way its eyes still held trust despite its pain. The fierce determination of the leopardess to protect her injured child. He'd crossed a line then, choosing to care instead of merely observe. Now that line felt like a chasm, with his principles on one side and his professional survival on the other. Elena checked the cub's vitals again, her movements gentle but precise. We still have options. I have contacts at a wildlife sanctuary in Idaho. If we can stabilize the cub, they'll never approve a transfer, Samuel interrupted. Not with Calvin's influence. Then we fight harder, she insisted. We document everything, build our case, make it impossible for them to ignore the truth. Samuel felt the weight of their expectations, their unwavering conviction. He'd started this journey believing science and compassion could coexist. Now, with his career in shambles and a dying cub under his care, that belief seemed painfully naive. The cub stirred on the table, making a small, pained sound that cut straight to Samuel's heart. He moved closer, placing his hand near its head. Despite the fever, despite the pain, the cub's eyes met his with that same trust he'd seen in the wild. He stood there, torn between his instinct to protect his life's work and the fierce need to stand by his principles. Everything he built could be lost. His reputation, his research, his ability to make a difference in the field he loved. All of it hanging by a thread. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. Walk away now, salvage what he could of his career, or risk losing everything for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless. The choice felt impossible, yet he knew it would define not just his future, but who he truly was. Through the tense, thin walls, Samuel heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Marcus burst in, his face flushed from running and his eyes wild with purpose. Doc, you need to see this, he said, pulling a weathered leather notebook from his jacket. I've been tracking Calvin's movements for the past 3 days. Elena looked up from the cub, her hand still steady on its burning flesh. Samuel moved closer as Marcus spread the notebook on a nearby table, revealing detailed maps and hastily scribbled notes. Here, Marcus jabbed his finger at a marked location. There's an old barn on the far edge of Calvin's property. I followed one of his trucks there last night. It's not just about the leopards or cattle. It's so much bigger. Samuel studied the crude drawings. What exactly did you find? Cages, Marcus's voice cracked. Dozens of them. Some empty, some... He swallowed hard. There were snow leopard, pelts, bare gallbladders, parts from animals that shouldn't even be in Montana. He's running an illegal wildlife trade right under everyone's noses. The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow. The cub whimpered softly from the examination table, and suddenly its suffering took on an even darker meaning. This was never about protecting livestock, he whispered. No, Marcus agreed grimly. The snares, the threats, it's all part of his business. He's been doing this for years. My brother, his voice caught. I think that's what he stumbled onto before the accident with the snare. Elena joined them, her medical gloves removed. We need proof, something concrete we can take to the authorities. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing them dark, grainy photos. Already got some. These shipping manifests I found show deliveries to addresses in Asia. The dates, the weights, they match up with black market prices for animal parts. Samuel's mind raced. This changed everything. The cub wasn't just a victim of random cruelty. It was part of a systematic operation that had likely claimed countless other animals. His earlier doubts about intervening dissolved, replaced by a cold clarity. We need to move fast, he said, newfound determination strengthening his voice. Calvin's got connections in the wildlife department, but this goes beyond state jurisdiction. This is federal territory now. Elena nodded. I know someone at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She specializes in trafficking cases. And I've got more locations mapped out, Marcus added, flipping through his notebook. Storage facilities, meeting points. Been following his men whenever I could. There's a pattern to their movements. Samuel looked back at the cub, its small chest rising and falling with each troubled breath. Its mother, the leopardess, was being kept in a separate enclosure nearby, her protective instincts making treatment challenging. He'd been so focused on saving this one family that he'd missed the larger picture. But now, the pieces were falling into place. Here's what we do, Samuel said, gathering Elena and Marcus closer. We document everything. Every cage, every shipment record, every animal part we can find. We build a case so solid that even Calvin's political connections can't bury it. It's dangerous, Elena warned. If Calvin realizes what we're doing. He already tried to stop us once. Marcus reminded them, unconsciously touching a bruise on his jaw from their first rescue attempt. He won't hesitate to try again. Samuel squared his shoulders. Then, we'll be smarter this time. Marcus, can you get us into that barn without being seen? Marcus nodded. There's a back road through the forest. Guards only patrol the main entrance. We'll need to time it right, though. I can have my contact at Fish and Wildlife ready to move within 24 hours, Elena offered. But we need to be certain about what we're claiming. Samuel looked at each of them in turn. Elena with her unwavering compassion. Marcus with his hard-won knowledge of the land and its secrets. They'd come together to save one cub, but now they had the chance to stop the source of so much suffering. We start tonight, he decided. Elena, stabilize the cub as best you can. Marcus, draw up everything you know about guard rotations and access points. I'll prepare the documentation we already have. He paused, feeling the weight of what they were about to attempt. What Calvin's doing, it stops now. Not just for this cub, but for every animal he's ever hurt. The cub stirred on the table, letting out a small pained sound. Its mother answered with a worried call from her enclosure. Samuel moved to check on them both, his resolve hardening with each step. He'd questioned his choice to intervene, had merely given up in the face of pressure and threats. But now, with the truth of Calvin's operation exposed, he understood that stepping back had never really been an option. Justice wasn't just about saving one life anymore. It was about confronting a system of cruelty that had gone unchecked for far too long. Samuel looked at his small team, a veterinarian, a tracker, and a wildlife biologist, all that stood between Calvin's greed and more senseless suffering. 24 hours, he said firmly. Let's make them count. Cages, Marcus's voice cracked. Dozens of them. Some empty, some... He shook his head. There were mountain lion cubs, wolf pups, all destined for private collectors. Calvin's been running an illegal wildlife trafficking operation right under our noses. Samuel's hands clenched into fists. The pieces clicked together. The snares. The threats, Calvin's desperate attempts to shut them down. It was never just about protecting his cattle. We need evidence, he said firmly. Something concrete that the authorities can't ignore. Elena gently covered the sleeping leopard cub with a blanket and joined them at the table. What's the plan? Samuel pulled out his phone and showed them an app. I've got 6 trail cameras with night vision and cellular connectivity. We set them up around the barn. They'll send images directly to our phones. He paused, looking at his companions. But if Calvin catches us, he won't, Marcus said firmly. I know every blind spot on that property. They spent the next hour plotting camera positions on Marcus's hand-drawn map. Elena contributed her knowledge of animal transport patterns, while Samuel marked the best angles for capturing vehicle license plates and faces. As dusk approached, they split up to place. The cameras. Samuel's heart pounded as he crouched in the tall grass, carefully securing a camera to a weathered fence post. The barn loomed ahead, its wooden walls dark against the purple sky. Every snapping twig made him freeze. Hours later, back at their makeshift headquarters, Samuel watched the first images trickle in. Grainy night vision photos showed Calvin's men moving cages between trucks. His hands trembled as he saved each one. This could ruin us if we're wrong, Elena said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. The touch sent warmth through his tired body. Samuel turned to face her. In the dim light of the monitors, her eyes held both concern and determination. And if we're right, it could save countless animals from suffering like our cub, he replied. Elena moved closer, her presence steadying him. You've changed since I first met you, Samuel. The cautious scientist who worried about overstepping bounds. He's found his courage. I'd help, Samuel said quietly, meeting her gaze. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words. A sudden alert from Samuel's phone broke the moment. New images were coming in, a large truck backing up to the barn's entrance. Look. At this, he said, enlarging the photo. That's Calvin himself. They watched through the night as their cameras captured a steady stream of activity. Each image built their case stronger. Around 3 a.m, Elena brought them coffee, her fingers brushing Samuel's as she handed him a cup. When I was in vet school, she said, settling beside him, they taught us to remain professional, detached. But some animals just get to you, don't they? Like our little fighter in there. She nodded toward the tent where the cub rested. Samuel smiled, remembering his own early struggles between scientific distance and compassion. That cub changed everything. Made me realize sometimes the right choice isn't in any textbook. We'll need to move fast once we have enough evidence, Elena said. Calvin has friends in high places. I've got a contact at the Federal Wildlife Service, Samuel replied. Someone who won't be bought off. We just need enough proof. Through the tent's opening, they could see the first hints of dawn coloring the sky. Samuel felt Elena's shoulder against his, drawing strength from her presence. Together, they watched their trap slowly close around Calvin Hargrove, knowing that with each passing hour, the risk of discovery grew. Marcus returned from his patrol, nodding in satisfaction. No sign anyone spotted the cameras. But we should check them before full light, reposition any that might be visible in daylight. Samuel stood, stretching his stiff muscles. Elena rose with him, her hand briefly catching his. Be careful out there, she said softly. The morning air was crisp as Samuel and Marcus moved through the property, adjusting cameras with practiced stealth. Each step could bring discovery, but Samuel felt a new certainty in his purpose. The image of the suffering cub, combined with Elena's unwavering support, had crystallized his resolve. Back at camp, Elena updated them on the cub's condition. "The fever's finally breaking," she reported. "All this risk, it has to be worth something more than saving just one life. Taking down Calvin's operation could protect so many more." Samuel nodded, checking the latest batch of photos. "We're close," he said. "So close to having what we need." He felt Elena's presence beside him, steady and sure, as they prepared for whatever Calvin's discovery of their surveillance might bring. The night deepened as Samuel, Elena, and Marcus crouched behind dense brush, their eyes fixed on the clearing. Ahead, their trail cameras had caught Calvin setting new snares in this area just hours earlier. The moonlight cast long shadows through the trees, making every movement seem threatening. "There," Marcus whispered, pointing to a figure moving through the trees. Calvin's broad-shouldered silhouette was unmistakable as he worked methodically, setting cruel metal traps along known animal paths. Samuel's hands trembled as he steadied his camera, documenting every movement. The evidence was clear now. Calvin wasn't just protecting his ranch. He was deliberately trapping predators for profit. Each click of the shutter felt like justice in the making. Elena touched Samuel's arm. "We have enough. Let's call the authorities." But before Samuel could respond, a twig snapped behind them. They turned to find two of Calvin's men, rifles raised. Well, one sneered. "Look what we caught in our trap." Calvin's voice boomed from the clearing. "Bring them out here." As they were marched into the open, Samuel saw rage twist Calvin's features. "You just couldn't leave well enough alone." "Could you, Doctor? Doctor?" "It's over, Calvin," Samuel said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "We have everything documented. The snares, the trafficking operation, all of it." Calvin's laugh was cold. "You think documentation matters out here?" He raised his own rifle. "Animals disappear in these woods all the time. Sometimes people do too." The tension crackled like electricity. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped forward, placing himself between Calvin's gun and his friend's. "You've hurt enough innocent creatures. I won't let you continue." "Such nobility," Calvin mocked. "But what has it gotten you? Your career is already finished. One word from me to the right people, and your precious research permits are gone forever." "Some things matter more than permits," Samuel replied, thinking of the injured cub fighting for survival. Calvin's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, Doctor. Walk away now. Delete everything, and maybe you'll have a future left." Time seemed to slow. Samuel saw Elena's terrified face, felt Marcus tensing beside him. He thought of all the animals that would suffer if Calvin continued his operation. "No," he said firmly. "I won't walk away." The gunshot shattered the night's silence. Samuel felt searing pain as the bullet grazed his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward. But before Calvin could fire again, Marcus launched himself forward with surprising speed. Years of tracking had made him quick and silent, and Calvin never saw him coming. The two men crashed to the ground, the rifle spinning away into the underbrush. Calvin's men moved to help their boss, but Elena was faster. She'd already hit the emergency signal on their satellite phone, and distant sirens began to wail. Samuel pressed his hand against his bleeding shoulder, watching as Marcus expertly pinned Calvin to the ground. The wealthy rancher's facade of power crumbled as police vehicles appeared on the logging road, their lights painting the trees in red and blue. "You're finished," Samuel said quietly as officers swarmed the scene. "No more trapped animals. No more suffering for profit." Hours later, as dawn broke over the mountains, Samuel sat in the emergency room getting his shoulder stitched. Elena hadn't left his side, her hand warm in his. The news was already spreading. Calvin Hargrove arrested for wildlife trafficking, attempted murder, and countless environmental violations. Your government position, Elena started gently, but Samuel shook his head. I knew the risks when I chose to act instead of observe. Some prices are worth paying. A week later, Samuel stood at the rehabilitation center, watching through reinforced glass as the leopard cub exercised its healing leg. The limp would always be there, but like Samuel himself, the cub had found ways to adapt and survive. Marcus appeared beside him. The feds found shipping records going back 5 years. Calvin's operation was huge, but it's done now, thanks to you. Thanks to us, Samuel corrected. He turned to Elena, who was reviewing the cub's medical charts. All of us. Elena smiled, and in that moment, Samuel realized that losing his official position had given him something far more valuable. He'd found a new purpose, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. He discovered that sometimes the most important scientific truth was compassion. The cub pressed its paw against the glass, eyes bright with intelligence and resilience. Like this young predator, Samuel had been transformed by adversity. He had learned that justice sometimes required more than observation. It demanded action. Courage and heart. As Elena's hand found his, Samuel knew he'd chosen the right path. Science had taught him to observe life, but love had taught him to protect it. In the end, that made all the difference. Thank you for watching. If even one moment stayed with you, don't forget to subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow with another story that speaks to the heart.